Excellent. Welcome everyone online and in person. We've got a nice group with us here in Waterloo today. My name is Carol-Ann MacGregor. I am an associate director here at the Institute for Religion, Culture, and Societal Futures. And I have the pleasure today of introducing friends of the ICRSF, Sarah and Galen. Those of you who have attended our webinars before know them quite well. But today we get to hear about some of their more recent work. So even though many of you will know them, I'm going to give them proper introductions. So Sarah Wilkins-Laflamme is the director of the Institute for Religion, Culture, and Societal Futures. She's an associate professor here at the University of Waterloo. Sarah, as many of you know, is well known for her nationally and internationally recognized work that often uses large quantitative survey data on religion and non-religion. Of special note, the International Social Survey Program is something that she's deeply involved in. I won't spend all of our time together listing all of her many journal articles and publications, but she's published widely on areas ranging from polarization in religion, voting behavior, attitudes towards Muslims and Islamophobia, and religion, spirituality, and secularity among millennials, including her 2022 book on that topic with Routledge. She's also the co-author of an important book that many of you will know with Joel Thiessen, None of the Above, Non-Religious Identity in the US and Canada. Also with us today is Galen Watts, who is an associate director here at the ICRSF and assistant professor of sociology here at the University of Waterloo. Galen is a scholar of cultural and institutional change in liberal democracies since the 1960s, with special focus on the areas of religion, morality, work, and politics. He is also widely published in these areas, and I won't list his whole CV here. Many of you will know his first book was The Spiritual Turn, The Religion of the Heart and the Making of Romantic Liberal Modernity, which came out on Oxford University Press also in 2022. We have the pleasure today of talking about one of their recent articles, and I won't actually spend much time setting it up and telling you what the article is about. I was reflecting on our format for today, which isn't going to involve a PowerPoint presentation from Sarah and Galen, but is really more conversational, where we have some questions to get the conversation started and to draw out the context so that those of you who haven't had a chance to read the article will sort of know some of the basics, but we want to leave opportunity for those of you online and in the room to enter into the conversation and be in dialogue as well. And I found myself reflecting, we don't actually do that all that often in academia, right? We have these very formal kind of presentations, but very rarely do we actually ask people, like, why did you want to write about that? And, how did you come about it process-wise or argument-wise, or how did your thinking evolve? So today we have that opportunity with their new article, The Secular Sacred Canopy, a Paradigm Revision in the Study of Secularization, which came out in the journal Sociological Theory. So without further ado, I'm going to jump right into the questions so that we have time, hopefully, for you to enter into the conversation as well. And those of you who attended our events before know we have a joke about our tiny microphones. These are the return of the tiny microphone. So I'm going to return this tiny microphone to Galen and hope I don't forget to do so. But the first question is, what made you initially want to write this paper? What observations had you made in your previous work and experience that led you to want to rework the secularization paradigm?
Yeah, well, thanks so much, Carol-Ann. I can get started.
Oh, you've got
there's two tiny mics, Galen.
I'm so sorry. I didn't even see it.
So we got us covered. Well, okay, so I mean, the first thing was that Galen got hired in our department. Oh, I want to write with Galen. So that was an exciting thing. But also there was a few things I'd been starting to notice that I was kind of putting together in my brain. The first was in a lot of the classrooms I was in when I was teaching sociology of religion, our students, they're from sociology and legal studies. They're not as a religious crowd as you might get, say, in religious studies or in maybe some of the more Christian-based universities and colleges. And so what I was noticing, one, they didn't know anything about religion. I'm sure all of those of you teaching religion these days have noticed that. But also there was this kind of like I was expecting a wide diversity of ideas and worldviews that they bring to the table, and there was that, but there was also this kind of underlying similarity between mainly what a lot of them asked me questions about, as well as what kind of work they want to do on their final research papers. And it was always around topics kind of like, the problem of religion with the LGBTQ plus community, or the problem with religion and race, or the problem with religion and women, for example. And those were topics that, the students thought they were really innovative, and some of the papers were, but they did come up a lot again and again. And I was kind of always sat back and like, I wonder where that's coming from. It wasn't for them, it wasn't an overt negative opinion of religion, but it was kind of almost like an unconscious kind of, they tended to see it in a bit more of a negative light. And it was interesting to kind of maybe dig into where that came from a bit more. So that was the first thing. Also in my statistical work, I was noticing two key numbers that kept coming up again and again in Canada, as well as in other Western nations. Very high rates of disaffiliation, right? Many of you are aware of that. But also the very high retention rate of people who got a non-religious socialization. So if you were raised with no religion as a kid in Canada, you're 91% likely to go on to be non-religious as an adult. So that's from 2020 General Social Survey data here in Canada. And that retention rate, so that's kind of, you're the same non-religious as a kid as you are as an adult. That's very high. That's like one of the highest retention rates we have amongst religious traditions and non-religious traditions in the country. And it's something we see as well in other countries. And so I was wondering, what makes non-religion so appealing, right? We know there's been a decline in religion over the decades and over generations. But what is it about non-religion that people want to retain it so much, that so many people just end up keeping going with it as adults, and that it also draws in new people from a more religious background who disaffiliate and kind of become non-religious? So that was kind of the other thing. And part of that is my collaboration with the Non-Religion in a Complex Future project that's led by Laura Beeman from the University of Ottawa. And it's kind of getting us to ask questions like, we know what the non-religious are not, right? They're not religious, but what are they, right? What's their substantive content? Kind of what identities do they have? What worldviews do they have? The NCF project likes to use the term life stances. So what are their life stances, their practices? So who are they and what's behind their kind of ideas? Because we don't talk a lot about them, but there's definitely something going on there. And I don't think it's just fragmentation or pluralism. There's obviously that, but there's also maybe something else that's being shared there, and kind of want to dig into that some more.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. So just to add on that, I mean, for me, I've been thinking about secularization theory for a while. It was something that I was grappling with a lot in my PhD when I was thinking about the turn to spirituality. And I've had this kind of ambivalent relationship to the sort of paradigm, the kind of classical understanding of the paradigm, where I've sensed that there's something very important and insightful there. I don't dismiss it, but also that it's missing important things. And I think foremost for me in terms of influence has been kind of two people. So one is Charles Taylor. I'm sure many people on this call or in the room will know of Taylor's book A Secular Age, which is really a critique of what he calls this subtraction story of secularization. The idea that what secularization is really just a kind of moving away of the sort of religious icing, and then you get this kind of this almost natural secular society that again, once you remove the religious overbrush, that's what's left over. And I've always found that that critique very powerful, and so have been trying to sort of think through it. The other person that, of course, if you've read this article, you'll see his influence very clearly, just Peter Berger, who I think is interesting. I mean, we try and talk about this in the paper. I think that Berger has this very sort of bifurcated way of thinking about modernity that tacks back and forth between what we call a Weberian account of modernity and a Durkheimian account of modernity. Is modernity a kind of alienated, disenchanted, kind of meaningless wasteland, or is it actually a kind of imposing social and symbolic order of its own. Those are the sort of the two different, and I think that you find both of these different accounts in Berger. And what I came to think about in sort of thinking about Taylor and Berger together is that, I think Taylor's insights are right, but he sort of, certainly for a sociological audience, I think he hasn't been fully understood because his vocabulary and sort of the concepts he brings to his work. And so I wanted to try and, you could say, sociologize Taylor, right, by thinking about him in light of Berger's kind of classical sociology. And to do that, I think it required going back to Berger's early work with Thomas Luckmann on social construction, which argues that really, what we are as human beings, what the fundamental insight of sociology is that the social world that we live in is kind of sui generis. It emerges out of social interaction. It isn't this thing that like just pre-exists. So it isn't something, for instance, that like if you take away the religious dimension, then you end up with some natural, some natural secular or non-religious reality. That all social worlds are socially constructed in the Berger sense, maybe not in the post-structuralist sense. So that insight, I think, is very, very important. And I think it's one that secularization theory and in a lot of its guises hasn't taken seriously. And so the last thing I'll just say is what then sort of allowed me with Sarah to sort of think about this substantively was drawing on a kind of relatively emergent subfield in sociology, which is cultural sociology. And so we try and employ a lot of different concepts and frameworks that cultural sociologists have devised, in relatively recent years, to think about religious change. And I think it was that combination of sort of this larger theoretical infrastructure that Berger and Taylor support or encourage, and then sort of having these precise, this conceptual kind of language and architecture that cultural sociology offers that help to kind of clarify this, at least in my head.
I think that's a wonderful sort of exposition on sort of some of the motivation. For the benefit of anybody online or in the room who hasn't yet had a chance to read the piece, what would you say the core argument of the paper is? Maybe we'll start with you, Galen.
Okay, so I think for those of you who are familiar with the work of Berger, it's a pretty straightforward, it should be very straightforward for you, because in effect, we use his concept, the sacred canopy, and we just attach, the secular qualifier to it, right? So in a way, it's as simple as saying like there is a secular sacred canopy. But to be a little bit more kind of detailed about it, I think the argument is that we need to understand the process of secularization as, and of course it is a process, as a kind of transition period or process of moving from a once religious sacred canopy, right, where you have a kind of overarching symbolic order that is, and this is important, that is sort of deeply institutionalized at the kind of macro and meso levels in society, such that there are sort of taken for granted assumptions about the world if you are inhabiting, if you're in that, under that canopy. So secularization, as we understand it, is the process whereby that once religious sacred canopy is kind of gradually corrodes and is over a period of time kind of supplanted with an emergent secular sacred canopy. But we think it's important to understand this as a process because it means that we distinguish in the paper between early stage, mid stage, and late stage. And those stages denote kind of the degree to which there is an older sacred canopy that remains dominant, or a new sacred canopy which has either not yet emerged dominant and sort of contesting or clashing with the older one, or has in fact arisen and taken the older one's place. And so, we think about this sacred canopy as a kind of, I like the term cultural cosmology. That's a term we get from John Mayer and neo-institutionalists. We can think about it as the kind of corrosion of an older religious cultural cosmology into the mid stage where you have this kind of clashing of different cosmologies such that there isn't really an overarching kind of uncontested symbolic order. And we think it's in that period where you're going to have experiences of what Weber would call disenchantment. And so here we're thinking with Weber about, what was he capturing when he talked about, disenchantment? We think something like, the period of mid-stage secularization. And then we think, late-stage secularization is really characterized by the emergence and really the kind of consolidation of what we call a secular sacred canopy or the secular cosmology, such that it is institutionalized across macro and meso levels in various public domains. It is the institutionalized or legitimate public culture. It's the taken for granted public culture in the society. Now we obviously, we have these qualifications. It can be differently institutionalized across specific regions and contexts and so on. But, if we're thinking about the macro. And so what this means is that we tend to think about most of Western Europe, for instance, and indeed even Canada as sort of falling closer to the late stage secularization spectrum. Whereas we would say that the US, for instance, is actually closer to the mid stage. Where exactly on that continuum, we could sort of debate, but we think that's one way of understanding the different dynamics that you see in these societies. So I think, in broad terms, that's the argument, that this is the best way to understand the process of secularization. Now we also have a number of I think one of the things that's, in a way, I actually don't think that's all that innovative, what I just said. I do think maybe one of the things that the paper does that's helpful is it introduces a new conceptual vocabulary, as I said, indebted to cultural sociology, that helps us to think about this process in a way that I don't think sociology of religion has really had, and in fact, I think needs. So one of the most important conceptual distinctions that we introduce is the distinction between public and personal culture. This is a very important distinction in cultural sociology, and it's really referring to, so I should say that it kind of comes out of cultural sociologists' engagement with neuroscience and behavioral economics. And the basic idea here is that what we call culture actually comes in different forms. And we as humans kind of relate to it differently. So when I talk about public culture, I really mean things like public narratives, even at the most abstract level, public codes, symbols, and what sociologists sometimes call scripts. And these are, the reason it's called public culture is because it is institutionalized in sort of public, it is what we would call extrapersonal, meaning it exists, for instance, at the level of policy, at the level of particular norms and particular institutional domains, maybe textbooks, laws, so on, right? So it exists in that form. That is public culture. Then there is personal culture. And personal culture is basically the culture that we have in our heads or in our bodies. And there is a really interesting, I think, literature on sort of different kinds of personal culture, which we don't go that into, although I think sociology of religion would benefit from doing this. But in any case, we can distinguish between public culture and personal culture, which is really more in the realm of kind of beliefs and sort of values and ideologies and worldviews. So the reason I think this distinction is very important for sociology of religion is that we primarily understand the process of secularization, although it of course has implications for personal culture. We're really interested in how it operates at the level of public culture. At the level of kind of legitimate institutionalized culture, taken for granted scripts, taken for granted narratives and symbols and codes that again are deeply institutionalized, taken for granted, whether it's in the educational sphere, whether it's in healthcare, in politics, in science, professional science, academia, so on. So, one of the things that the article is trying to do is sort of highlight and emphasize the role of institutionalized public culture in the process of secularization. And the reason for this is that, I think often we as sociologists of religion have tended to focus on, again, we didn't call it this, but tended to focus on personal culture, right? You think about beliefs, you think about people's worldviews and so on. And
the central insight of cultural sociology in this domain is that it is extremely common to have what's called decoupling between public culture and personal culture. This is just it's basically a truism in cultural sociology that what people the scripts and narratives and codes that sort of reign and dominate in particular institutional spheres are not necessarily, and often are in fact not aligned with what people privately believe, right? And we think that distinction helps us to understand how, for instance, you could have high levels of religious belief even in a very, very secular society in the way that we understand it, right? With this secular sacred canopy. I've spoken a lot. Should I go into the tenets of the secular sacred canopy, or
Go for it.
Okay. So I'll try and be brief. So the other key concept, of course, is just what exactly is the secular sacred canopy, and just one thing we should note is that we are not saying that all secular sacred canopies are the same. Just as similarly, it would be Berger would never say that all religious sacred canopies are the same. They're going to be shaped by particular religious traditions. Similarly, I think with secular sacred canopies. But so the one that we're sort of substantiating is really the one that we think is typical and dominant in Western liberal democracies like Canada, the US, and much of Western Europe. And the way that we understand it is that, again, if you think about it as a cultural cosmology, it is comprised, we argue, of kind of three broad cultural models, again, working at the level of public culture. And those three different kind of pillars, these sort of models, capture epistemological, ontological, and moral dimensions, right? So they think of them as sort of shaping the taken for granted common sense in these societies. So the epistemological dimension is basically defined by scientific empiricism, that we think under a secular sacred canopy, science is the dominant, legitimate way of knowing, such that alternative ways of knowing, right, basically have to kind of the only way that they can kind of legitimate themselves is often by appealing to science, by saying, they align with science in some way. At the very least, they don't conflict with us, right? So science has this incredible institutional authority that, that forces everyone, again, in order to be, as it were, taken seriously, right? Everyone has to make appeals to this, to science. The ontological dimension is naturalism. And we think that this follows very kind of logically from the epistemological dimension. Basically, the assumption under the secular sacred canopy is that the natural world exhausts reality, put that way. And crucially, again, if we're talking about this at the level of public culture, it means that across various modern institutions, whether it's education, whether it's healthcare, whether it's, again, politics, that all of these domains institutionalize a kind of naturalist conception of reality, right? That they work under the assumption that the natural world it exhausts reality, and that we're not going to have, for instance, gods or supernatural beings come and interfere with our elections or with medical processes or whatever, right? So this is just a taken for granted assumption. And then the last pillar is one that, for those of you who know kind of my first book and my work will know that this is one that I've been thinking a lot about, for some time, is a moral dimension, and we call it a romantic liberal imaginary, kind of drawing from Charles Taylor's notion of a social imaginary. And the basic idea here is that there are really kind of two sacred ideals, moral ideals in late modern societies, kind of post-1960s liberal democracies. They are autonomy, individual autonomy, and personal authenticity. And I think I see these as really emerging out of the traditions, respectively, of liberalism, which liberal human rights regimes, liberal democratic policies institutionalize, sacralize individual autonomy, and the tradition of Romanticism, going back to Rousseau, with its sacralization of the ideal of authenticity. And as Sarah was alluding to, right? I mean, anybody who's sort of taught students today will be familiar with these as kind of the taken for granted moral ideals of late modern life. And so they operate, again, the crucial thing is that they are taken for granted, that they kind of, they are the water we swim in, another way of putting it. So that is, again, in the broadest sense, what we see as the content, the cultural content of the secular sacred canopy that we live under. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. Do you want to add?
No, I'm good.
No.
That's pretty good.
Yeah, well, now we're really into kind of the thick of the argument. And I'm actually going to, we had talked about 4 questions in advance, and I'm going to go to the 4th one because I feel like we've touched on some of the things in the 3rd, but we can return to that if there's time. The 4th, I think, so I was noting, your title is not like a reconceptualization of secularization or a complication or a new theory. It is, you've went full Thomas Kuhn and said, like, this is a paradigm revision. And so one of the things that I think would be interesting to hear a little bit about is what phenomena in our Western societies today do you think that this paradigm revision that you're proposing is especially good at explaining? Or maybe another way of thinking that question is, what do you hope that other scholars will pick up with this new paradigm revision and sort of explore that maybe you didn't have a chance to do in this first articulation? I don't know which of you would like to start.
I can get started. Galen can jump in. That's a great question, Caroline. I mean, in the paper, we cover kind of 4 phenomena in our society that are sort of hot topics that we also think this kind of new revision helps with. So there's kind of, we talk about that cradle non-religion, which I talked about earlier, people keeping their non-religious socialization until adulthood. We also talk about the shift from religion to spirituality among certain populations in a lot of Western contexts. We also talk about religious populisms. And then finally, we come back to the heretical imperative, that concept of Burgers, of kind of, everyone has to choose, like it's everything's a choice, which is interesting because most people in our societies are choosing non-religion. Affiliation is much higher than, say, conversion into religion. And so there being a secular sacred canopy kind of helps us understand that. It's like, well, it's not like this empty void that we're making just all these choices based on our own personal preferences in. It's more that there's these these plausibility structures, these norms that are around us. For example, most of the curriculum in public schools is covering STEM sciences and not so much social sciences or not so much other ways of thinking in our current public school system, for example. And so we're kind of socializing people into this, and so it seems to be a quite popular form of legitimations in our society that instead of creating people that are like a blank slate that are open to anything, are in fact actually plugged into, in these cases, you're talking about science, naturalism, and this expressive individualism especially. There's obviously people can push back against that, but a lot of people take those things for granted. And so this is kind of going on in the background. To come into one of, we won't have time to go into all of 4 of those in detail, but back to the cradle non-religion, I think, a lot of secularization theorists currently, how they see that kind of secular socialization or non-religious socialization is like, it's just removing religion, and then individuals become naturally, quote unquote, more autonomous, more kind of authentic or personally authentic. Kind of science becomes kind of like the norm. Of course, it would be science because that's what's true in some ways, right? Like they really have this kind of realist version of society once religion is removed from it. And Galen and I are pushing back against that and saying, like, no, that's the cultural script. That's the norms they're learning. Again, it's socially constructed, so we won't call it quote unquote real or natural, but it means that people are being socialized into these values and into these norms. And so they don't necessarily leave. They're not meaning, like they don't have no meaning in their lives. They don't have no worldview. That's the worldview. It's just a non-religious one. And so it's kind of understanding that they're raised non-religious, but also what's the substantive content of that childhood, of that socialization that many keep into adulthood, right? And so this theory kind of helps us better understand that is, okay, there is something going on, because often parents don't consciously think about it when they're non-religious. If you interview non-religious parents, like some of my colleagues have in other projects, the parents themselves are like, oh, we just leave it up to the kids. It's a choice. But that's a script in itself. It's like, oh, it's up to the individual to make the choice. And that's the script that they're teaching the kids. And that's a script that de-emphasizes, for example, religious authority, scriptural authority, and puts the kind of onus and the authority more with the individual. And so, and people kind of go on to have that approach to life. And it's part of our consumer economies, right? It's part of our democratic institutions to think that way. And people, it's so taken for granted that people don't even think about it, right? Like when I'm in a classroom and I say human rights are a social construction, they're a good social construction, but they're only appeared after the Second World War, really, in Western nations in a proper sense. Students, like, it blows, like, sometimes it blows their mind in a bad way, but they're like, no, it's real. And it's like, well, that's really interesting. Like, that's part of the script and the norms we have. We're not saying that's a bad thing. We're just saying, all societies have that. And what are those scripts and normative structures that exist in our current day societies as we've transitioned away from Christian ones, which were more typical in Western nations in the past?
I don't have anything to add, actually. I mean, I would love to open it up to questions. I mean, I could obviously say more, but I want to savor that we have all these people, and
yeah,
if there's any questions.
Okay, so yeah, if everyone's ready, we can move to Q&A. So guys online, if you have a question, you can just raise your virtual hand or post in the chat if you have a question. And guys in the room, just raise your hand. And Caroline's going to run the mic, the tiny microphone. And okay, so Kevin's got a question in the room, so give us a moment. He's about to ask it.
Sarah and Galen, I don't think you'll be surprised to hear that I love this article, and in fact had to restrain myself from reading passages out loud to my wife as I was working through it. Yes, I did restrain myself for the sake of our marriage, but I'm sold on the argument, and I think it's an article that I hope is read widely and engaged with widely. And so I kind of was struggling to come up with sort of a challenging or critical question, but this is the closest I can get. I think maybe we can push some of your argument a little bit further, perhaps. You're very kind to the classical paradigm, maybe the neoclassical paradigm. And you give it sort of credit for being compatible with the early to mid stage sort of Weberian phase of secularization. But I'm wondering, given the revisions that you've introduced, is there actually any explanatory power left with respect to secularization specifically in some of the classical drivers of secularization, like structural differentiation, instrumental rationality being worked out in institutions, maybe pluralism? Putting my own cards on the table, I'm actually not really convinced about any of those three as master trends to begin with. But if we, for the sake of argument, accept that those are master trends in modernization, in the classical paradigm, those are things that then drive secularization, right? And it's not clear to me, once we kind of go along with your revision that recasts the secular sacred canopy as its own nomos, as its own kind of thing that is constructed, are those things still doing any work, really? Or are we just talking about a shift from one sacred canopy to another, which presumably could happen even without any of those factors being involved? So, yeah.
That's a great question, Kevin. Thank you. So, I mean, I do think that those, when they're revised in light of a kind of cultural sociological understanding, I still think that they have important explanatory power. So just to go through them. So I think that rationalization, for instance, is a profoundly secularizing power. But we have to understand it in the way that I think Weber originally did, which was as a byproduct of religious, ironically, right, origin, right? So the process, and this is John Mayer's argument that we lean really heavily on, that the process of rationalization, it's often framed in realist terms as purely about increasing efficiency or something like this, but actually it doesn't often in practice increase efficiency. It's more, it's a kind of it's about legitimation. It's a cultural script that is so deeply embedded in Western civilization, you could argue, that we just take it for granted. And I do think, though, that it plays a very important role in supporting the both the empiricist and the empirical and the ontological pillars. So it does. I think it is an important pusher of scientific empiricism and of naturalism in different ways. There's a great book which we cite quite a bit in the paper called "Science in the Modern Polity," and it makes this argument. So I do think rationalization, when understood cultural sociologically, remains very powerful. I actually think structural differentiation does as well. So I think that there is something about structural differentiation and the rise of the autonomous individual that I think is important. There's some important affinity between that structural change. And Durkheim argued this as well. Like, part of the reason why he thought you had the cult of the individual emerge was because of morphological changes that he, captured in the division of labor or structural differentiation. So there is something about, and I would even make the same argument about pluralism. So Berger's, big kind of addition to secularization theory. I think that not all cultural cosmologies equally sustain pluralism. The romantic liberal one does pretty well, precisely because it celebrates, individual self-expression. It celebrates diversity of certain kinds, right? So I think that these structural changes and also kind of their cultural sociological variants do play important roles. That's one of the reasons why it's a revision of the paradigm rather than a wholesale rejection.
Yeah, and I mean, we kind of touch on it quickly in the paper, and maybe it's worth developing further in future work, is that we're also seeing it in a lot of cases more of a top-down process. So those transformations start more at the elite level, right? The people in power, the people running these institutions are making these changes, and then they eventually might, in some cases, trickle down to the more kind of personal cultural level. It takes many generations. This is a long process, right? This is not something that happens overnight. And so maybe that's where we differ a bit, because a lot of classic secularization theories almost see it as like, oh, everyone just kind of moved away from religion either at the same time, or it's like, no, it's for me at least, and maybe we develop this further. And in your book, Kevin, you talk about some of the power dynamics involved of like kind of who's in charge, putting this into place, and kind of then the population has to deal with it, and other countries might have to deal with it, right? Depending if it's like colonial power, for example, who's pushing this, right? Oh, great question.
Seeing a lot of good questions online. Maybe do we want to start with
I think Ryan came
yeah.
first. Yeah, Ryan, do you want to jump in?
Sure. Thank you for doing this and for the paper. I think I largely agree with it. I've got some issues, not surprisingly. I like the looks on your faces. I know. So like broadly, I think we're in agreement. I'm going to start with something that I think you probably have already wrestled with at some point. I would be astonished if a reviewer hadn't hit you with this. I was definitely not a reviewer because I would have hit you with this, but you call it a secular sacred canopy, and at some level, like, that's a bit of an oxymoron, isn't it? Like, and I get that you're using sacred in a Durkheimian sense, right? Not in like a religious sense. So there's like an out that you can very easily kind of go like, well, but we mean something different by sacred here. I do think the term is problematic, right? I don't think that's actually the way that Berger meant sacred, right? And I could be wrong. I'm not an expert on Berger. I would actually defer to Galen on this. Like he I'm sure knows Berger way better than I do. But really, here's why I'm pushing back. What if this new canopy, if you will, is actually just profane? This is actually just the new normal. What makes it sacred then, right? There's actually nothing really special about it. It becomes the new default. So if we call it something sacred, that seems deeply problematic to me. I think I actually would have liked it better if you had just called this the new canopy or the new default culture, right? That would have been more compelling to me. But I'll stop there. So
yeah, I can get started, and then you can jump in, Galen. I mean, I think so. We are pushing Berger further, right? Yeah. So the idea is not to stick with him. We find, because he's writing in America where Christianity is still very dominant when he's writing. He's quite an intense Lutheran. He's in a certain context, and we feel, half a century later, we can move on in some ways. But we do like the concept of sacred canopy because, yeah, like you said, it's our out, but it is our out. Is that we're using it in the more sociological sense rather than just defining it as something that's religious. But I do still like the term sacred because even if something is normal or default, there's certain things that we value that are harder to question or to push back against. It's not that no one does in our societies, but if you go and say like, I don't really think individual autonomy should be a thing, right? Like that you're going to get pushback. That's almost seen, and this is back to my students who kind of consider this quasi-sacred, right? And not in a religious sense, but as something that's highly valued, that that you don't. It's hard to question in our society, and that we assign certain kind of awe and importance to. And so for me, that's how I see it, and that's why I wanted to push the concept further. All those of you who know me who've discussed this before, I hate introducing new concepts. Like we have enough concepts. Might as well just redefine it if we need to and use existing ones. That's why we keep secularization theory in my work. But you're pushing the concept further, you're developing it further. And in this case, it's like, okay, well, what do we have? It's not a Christian sacred canopy. Let's call it something. And we call it secular sacred canopy, building on Berger's work.
Yeah, I'll just add, because I think I completely agree. I'll just say you're right, Ryan, that Berger's conception of sacred is distinctive. It isn't purely Durkheimian. And we had a footnote saying this. We addressed this, but it was way too long. Our original version was like 22,000 words, so we had to cut quite a bit. That got cut. But so it is true. This is a more purely Durkheimian conception. But I think that, I would echo what there's a kind of a growing literature in, broadly speaking, cultural sociology that looks at sort of emerging sacred forms. And by sacred, it's understood really as about a taken for granted authority. And the crucial thing there is as so one is that it's taken for granted, but the other is that precisely as you were saying, Sarah, there is a kind of a reverence for that which is considered sacred, right? Such that a defilement, a violation of what is considered sacred is going to engender, often intense emotional, psychological responses. And there's a great book by Hans Joas called The Sacralization of the Person, which really makes this argument in very deep historical detail about how modernity is really, one of its defining features is the sacralization of the abstract person, right? At the heart of human rights regimes, of liberal democracy, is this kind of reverence for the individual. It's why we see a decline in torture. It's why we increasingly feel emotionally sick, at least many of us, at like thinking about human bodies being, violated in different ways, right? So these, are the sacredness of the child, right? These are deep things in our modern kind of consciousness. And I think the term sacred is useful for that, right? Like it's capturing things that really matter to us in ways that would, deeply offend us, or worse, were they to be violated.
Yeah, I see a question in the room, but we'll go with Sam Reimer, and then we'll get to the question in the room.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron Galen. Really interesting piece. I haven't read the article yet, so it might be answered in the article, and you'll just have to ignore the question then, or answer really briefly and say, look at the article. But when you were speaking, it reminded me some of Chris Smith's, is it 20 plus years old now, Secular Revolution book, which you do cite. I did see it in the article. But I think he makes the point that it was much more of an intentional process by elites that pushed us toward this new secular sacred canopy. Maybe stronger than your article brings out. Again, I haven't read it yet, but can you play with that a little bit? What's the drivers here? To what extent is it micro and what extent is it macro?
Yeah, I mean, arguably any sacred canopy is probably pushed by elites first in a lot of cases, right? I mean, I know there's the nice happy tale of Christianity just spreading throughout the population in the early medieval period, and everyone adopting it happily and they love it. But in reality, there was a lot of power struggles and a lot of violence involved, and a lot of top-down, monarchs who imposed it on populations. Not for everyone, but in a lot of contexts. And so, there's probably a bit of everything, right? There's enough different national and regional contexts that it probably, you'd have to then do like a specific history in each one to see. But yeah, in a lot of cases, like I was saying earlier, we do say like it started at least as a top-down a top-down process, like a lot of stuff does in the end in our societies. When it comes to changing norms, changing institutions, you often need power to be able to do it. Galen?
I have to lean really close.
Wait.
No, I would echo what Sarah's saying. And I mean, I think there might be a slight difference between what Chris argues in that book and what we say, because he's from a social movements perspective. He frames the secular revolution as a kind of social movement of sorts. And while I think that elites play a very important role in ushering in new sacred canopies, whether religious or secular, I actually think a lot of it, and we say this at the very, so this is a bit of a like, go read the article, Sam, but there is also an important process that cultural sociologists call institutional isomorphism, which is just a matter of often elites in different institutional domains wanting to sort of mimic or copy each other simply in order to seem legitimate. And I actually think that process, which is a much less sort of like conflictual, it's often about seeking legitimacy. Of course, power dynamics are involved, but I do think that's a very underrated process in the process of macro cultural change. And in the case of secularization, I think it's been a very important part of it, and we haven't really theorized it properly. So this is also kind of a nod to future work, but the process of institutional isomorphism, I think, is very important.
Hi, I have two questions. The first one I wanted to start with saying I really loved this article. I'm cradle non-religious who became disenchanted with the secular sacred canopy. So it really spoke to my growing up. But I was wondering, and one of those reasons was because the secular sacred canopy, and maybe you can speak to this, is so procedural. One of the reasons I became disenchanted with it was like a huge identity crisis. And there was no kind of substantive way for me to think of myself that way, if this makes sense. I'm having a hard time kind of articulating this. But I guess I'm curious if you could speak to, are there substantive like ways of thinking about the secular sacred canopy in terms of identity? Does this make sense? Yeah.
I think it does make sense. So, I mean, it's a very big question, and I think it's a really interesting one. So just a little bit. So the first thing to say is that, by the secular sacred canopy, or by any sacred canopy, we're talking about a very kind of broad, abstract cultural cosmology, which will give life to different particular forms on the ground, right? You would have seen this in Latin Christendom, of course, so you can have a sort of Christian sacred canopy, but on the ground, you're going to see incredible diversity, right? Now, so that's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that we actually, I don't know if you remember this, we had a section which will hopefully develop into its own paper on kind of the distinction between religious and secular disenchantments, which I think is actually a useful way to think about one thing that you're getting at. So with the way that we were conceptualizing it is that religious disenchantments are, we were thinking about that again in terms of like mid-stage secularization, where you have the corrosion of a religious sacred canopy. It hasn't been supplanted by a new one, and so you are in kind of that, think Weber disenchantment, like, there are no gods. There's just, it's kind of empty. Nietzsche captured this very, very powerfully. But I think that there's a kind of disenchantment that can exist under a consolidated secular sacred canopy, like in late stage secularization. And this actually, so this is work, that John Meyer has developed, thinking about the process of rationalization. This is why I think that rationalization is important. The way that rationalization continues to operate even in a highly secular nomos. So the way, for instance, that many of our everyday practices, whether it's certainly you would experience this in kind of occupational life, but even think about dieting, exercising, these are increasingly rationalized such that there is some technique that we're supposed to use, right? The life hack, some new
procedure that we're supposed to follow in order to be able to do this activity well, right? Whether it's, again, lose some weight, make a friend, make friends and influence people in the old adage, right? But that process of cultural rationalization, right, where there's increasing kind of optimization of everyday practices, that's taking place even under a secular sacred canopy. And I think it can engender a kind of secular disenchantment. Obviously the old word for this would have been alienation, right? But it's capturing, so it's not about a lack of meaning. If anything, it's about a rationalization of existing meaning structures, right?
No, yeah, there's that. And just to quickly wrap up on this one, I was thinking of Anna Strawn's talk that we had. We had Anna on a webinar in March, and she was talking, she had gone to schools in Britain and kind of talked to especially non-religious kids to see how they were, what kind of identities were they developing as coming from non-religious families. And maybe Debbie, this is a bit to your question as well in chat about how are people being socialized into the secular sacred canopy, if not through a religious group or through church. It's through parents, it's through, nature documentaries, it's at school. And like a lot of these kids, some might have experienced disenchantment, but many had a kind of more positive identity of kind of this, these individual values, the usual positive stuff we hear these days of, personal authenticity. And
that's not guaranteed.
Yeah, that's it. But that is kind of like the flip side of the coin of how people might, develop those identities within that kind of larger framework. Some might have a very positive view to science, others not, right? And that might change over the course of the lifetime too.
Well, this hour has gone by so quickly. We do have a little bit more time, but I'm wondering if it makes sense. We've got 2 online questions. If we just get those folks to...
Alassane was,
Yeah, we could maybe even have both people ask the question, and then you could sort of take them in. If there's time, we also have another one in the room. So Allison, do you want to get us started with your question?
Alassane, I know you wrote it in the chat, but it's a bit hard for us to read. Did you want to unmute and ask your question? Are you able to?
Je ne comprends pas trop l'anglais. Je suis
okay.
francophone.
OK, Alassane, peut-être ça va être mieux. Juste lance-moi un courriel avec votre question, puis je pourrais vous répondre en futur. Hein?
Oui, c'est 3 questions. La première, c'est par rapport à votre cadre.
Parfait. Ben, c'est ça. Envoie-moi un courriel, puis je vous répondrai à votre question. In that case, David, maybe?
Yeah, sure.
Sure. Hi. Thanks so much for this really interesting presentation, like the paper. I just wondered if you could talk just a little bit more. So you make this distinction between early, mid, and late stage secularization, which I think is interesting. What I'm wondering, what I sort of felt like I was looking for was something more explicit about what triggers the transition between these stages, and whether that trigger itself is like either a theoretical claim that you're making or whether there's sort of some empirical threshold. Because without that, it sort of seems a stage distinction sort of is sort of functioning as a bit of a sort of unfalsifiable device. So I'd just love to hear you talk more about how you think these stages are differentiated.
Yeah, it's a great question, David. I can get started and then Galen can jump in. In the background, we are kind of working with the empirical kind of secular transition process, right? I think that's kind of like the background that we're building our theoretical argument. Secularization isn't just an empirical process. It's also theory about why it's happening and what the outcome will be. But it's also, I guess for me, the way I understood it was kind of, in a more advanced stage or late stage secularization, it's when it's been kind of more prevalent at that personal culture level as well. So there's kind of amongst the population, a majority or a big chunk of it, maybe it's the whole population or at least amongst younger generations, they've moved away from organized religion, right? So they're the no religious affiliation crowd. They score very low on religiosity indicators, and that non-religious way of doing becomes like the kind of default, like that's what's taken for granted. And there's still people who are religious in those societies, but they have to justify themselves a bit more. They're seen as a bit weirder because it's a minority phenomenon now rather than what the majority of the population does. So that would be kind of your more advanced stage. Now, I understand that process as generational, right? Like it's not, at least from how I understand it, it's not usually like an abrupt transition that we're talking about. It's often a gradual one that this develops over a few generations. And back to Galen's example you're on, like the US would kind of be at a mid stage where a big chunk of its population is non-religious, but it's also still got a kind of Christian frame of mind that it's working with, and both sides are kind of vying for power, right? And that could be behind some of the polarization that we're seeing now. And so, yeah, and I mean, then I would just give maybe a boring but accurate answer that like it probably depends on the context as well, right? Like for example, in the province of Quebec, this whole process started very quickly, much quicker than you'd see it elsewhere with the Quiet Revolution. Obviously, there was a bit going on before that, but at an institutional level, it kind of triggered something, and the population followed quite quickly. It only took a generation or two afterwards to get to maybe like what we call more advanced late stage secularization now. So, Galen, you want to?
Well, no, I just think it's a great question, David. I don't think we have a great answer to it in that it does, because we're speaking at such a high level, right? But it is interesting, you made me think like, so there's kind of two parts to this question, right? One is about, are there triggers that sort of move it from one stage to the next? And then the other is just like, how would you empirically substantiate any given phase or stage? The triggers thing, I think, is going to be very complex. It brings in the Christian Smith's question about like, should we be looking at particular social movement actors, right? Elites in particular spaces and, battles that are being won or lost across different institutional spheres. I'm more kind of thinking about the second question, which is about empirically substantiating. If you think about the metaphor of a canopy, right? The idea is that it as it were, envelops or covers over society. And so the stage concept is really about like the extent to which it's fully covered or there's sort of, it's partially ripped open, or is it like super weak and sort of like, anyways, that's the sort of metaphor I'm thinking with. And it's interesting to think about like the Quebec Revolution, because so John Meyer, I think, has done interesting work that sort of is analogous to this, in that he's interested in looking at like changes at the institutional level in terms of like policies and legislation and norms. So it would be fascinating to think about like, over the course of this Quebec Revolution, you might want to do it. You might specify the institutional domain, or you might look at like whether there were shifts in the kind of underlying scripts or assumptions across like healthcare, for instance, or across. Yeah, I'm sure there was, but even just being able to like, you could quantify it insofar as like, a number of hospitals or whatever had changed their procedures in this way. And then, so again, if we're thinking about it as like, it's about degrees of enveloping, then you would want to think about just how much, like, are all hospitals, is this more like, oh, some are doing other one and others are doing that. So that, or is it very cohesive? Like everybody's just doing the same thing. And we're completely in the late stage place, right? So that's, again, that got me thinking in those terms. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, and just one last thing on that is an interesting paper that Laurie Beeman and Corey Steele wrote was about that transition in MAID legislation in Canada. So when MAID, medically assisted dying, became legalized in Canada, the court's decisions very explicitly laid out the values, especially towards surrounding expressive individualism, in a way we don't usually see explicitly said, right? A lot of the stuff that we're talking about is harder to study because it's taken for granted. People aren't always conscious of it or expressing it. But in the Supreme Court of Canada's decision, it's very explicit of like, okay, they literally say, we're moving away from this Christian model, right, that was kind of emphasizing, suffering and a higher power, and we're moving towards individual dignity, the old version was sanctity of life. We're moving towards a more kind of individual dignity model, right? And so they really see the explicit shift towards, and that was pretty recent, right? So again, it's showing that this process is still underway, even in a country like Canada, where it's been underway for many decades or many centuries, right? And so that's kind of maybe where you look for it empirically, as well as maybe like, attitudes that people share in public opinion that are kind of, you see it like an 80-90% level of support, that you don't even bother asking the question in the survey because everyone's going to support it, like human rights or other aspects like that. So that's kind of maybe a way to kind of start studying this more empirically, right? Cool.
Well, unfortunately, I think that puts us at time. Please join me in thanking Sarah and Galen. How lucky am I to get to have them as regular Institute thought partners and colleagues. Thank you for being with us. I think this is our last official event for the academic year, but we hope you'll, if you're not already signed up to our newsletter, that you'll sign up for that. And yeah, tons coming in the fall. So we're excited about that. And if anybody missed this, it'll be on our YouTube channel. So see you all soon. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.